Hi everyone. All right, so that last video didn't go quite as planned. That's okay. We're going to make the best of it. And now I'm going to try and do it in a little bit more sedate setting right here at the table. So today we're talking about how speciation can occur more specifically. Remember, speciation is the creation of a new species. And there are several ways that it can occur. The first is through something called geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is when one population of a species is split in two by a physical barrier, which would prevent those two groups from breeding. If those groups are separated by a physical barrier and can't interact, natural selection is going to work on both groups separately. And eventually, this can lead to new species being formed. The classic example of this is what happens on islands. If there is a population of, say, birds on one island, and a couple get blown off course and go to another island, and then they can't get back and forth, well, each of those islands might have different environments, and therefore natural selection is going to be different. As they're different, the population of birds on one island will eventually change, develop different adaptations, and over time might become entirely new species. That's speciation due to geographic isolation. The other way speciation can occur is through reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is when something prevents groups of the same population or the same species from breeding, from actually reproducing together. So it's not a physical barrier. They're in the same area, but something causes them to not interbreed anymore. And if they're not reproducing together and instead are reproducing in separate groups, then natural selection can also again occur, and those two groups can go through natural selection differently, leading to new species. And there are a few different types of reproductive isolation. The first is mechanical reproductive isolation. And in mechanical reproductive isolation, that's when the physical reproductive organs of one population literally can't work with the reproductive organs of another population. And a classic example of this occurs with mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, males, actually have very complicated reproductive organs. And even a small mutation can cause the physical anatomy of that male mosquito. His reproductive organs will not work anymore with a female. Now, sometimes this just means that that male can't reproduce and that individual dies off. But in some cases, mutations are such that now his reproductive organs only work with a specific other females. When that occurs, only those mosquitoes can reproduce. They're going to produce offspring that also have that variation. And over time, that can lead to a new species of mosquito. That's mechanical reproductive isolation. Then we also have ecological reproductive isolation. This sounds very similar to geographic isolation. In ecological reproductive isolation, though, there's a population that, even though they live in the same general area, there's not a physical barrier preventing them from interacting. Instead, they have certain differences in either food or habitat that causes them to be separate. For example, there are species of salamander that breed in slow, shallow water, and there are species of salamander that breed in fast-moving water. Even if those slow-moving waters and fast-moving waters are very close to each other, meaning the salamanders could interact, they don't, because they're breeding in separate ecological areas, which over time can lead to natural selection affecting those two populations differently and leading to the creation of new species. Next, we have temporal reproductive isolation. Temporal reproductive isolation is when different populations breed at different times of the year, meaning that if one group is breeding at one time of the year, they're not going to interact and reproduce with a group that's breeding at a different time of year. And the classic example of this is frogs. All around us right now in Maine, we have frogs where they are mating, and it's mating season, but not for all species. Certain species, like spring peepers and wood frogs, are active now, and they're mating. There are bullfrogs out there. There are green frogs out there. There are pickerel frogs out there. However, they're not breeding with the spring peepers or the wood frogs because their genes are telling them that they need to breed and mate when it's warmer out. Over time, that has led to the formation of new frog species or different frog species because only the frogs that are breeding right now are interacting and they're sharing a certain group of genes. And over time, those variations have led to new species of frog. Next, we have behavioral reproductive isolation. Behavioral reproductive isolation is when certain behaviors prevent one population from interbreeding with another. The classic example of this is many bird species. Many birds sing or do special dances in order to attract mates. If those dances or songs aren't attracting a different group, that group is never going to interact with the group that's singing and dancing. And over time, that can lead to speciation, the creation of a new species. In Maine, many different bird species, if you look at, let's say, cardinals and blue jays, both of which are active right now, well, they look different because they have different colorations, but they also have different songs. And those are probably a result of some type of behavioral reproductive isolation. They were all the same a long time ago. One group, let's say the cardinals, had a certain song that attracted one other smaller population of females. They started breeding. They had offspring that did the same song. Over time, you get a brand new species. And finally, we have gametic reproductive isolation. Gametic reproductive isolation occurs if there's a population that are not physically separated by a barrier, they breed at the same time of the year, they don't have any behaviors that interrupt them, they're all together in one habitat, and they actually breed. However, when their gametes, their egg and sperm, actually mix, they're not viable together. That's gametic reproductive isolation. And the classic example of this are horses and donkeys. We know horses and donkeys are separate species because when they reproduce, they make what's called a mule. A mule is a hybrid, which we talked about earlier. However, mules can't make more mules. They are sterile. So, well, yes, a mule is technically, it's an organism. It's actually, I don't know how to say it, basically, it sounds horrible to say, but kind of like a mistake of nature. It's not its own species. Because if it could reproduce, then it would be. But that would mean horses and donkeys were actually of the same species themselves. We know they're separate species, that speciation occurred at some point, because when they reproduce, they can't produce a viable offspring, an offspring that can make more offspring. So that's a lot of information, but the good news is this is the last new information that I'm going to be presenting to you this year in biology. Stay tuned. I'm going to get out to all the different classes, a chance to have a Google Meetup either later this week or early next week. I hope the end of the year goes well for all of you. Please, please, please let me know if I can help in any way. And thank you guys for a great year. Talk to you soon.